Hello, this is Professor Stephen Shwiff of Columbia Gorge Community College talking about the southern colonies, the Carolinas and Georgia. Now in 1663, King Charles II gave the land between Virginia, which had been settled way back in the early 1600s, and Spanish Florida to 8 proprietors, and this area was called the Carolinas. Now it would thrive as a rice producing in the southern areas and tobacco area in the northern Carolina through the 1700s. Now rice becomes a major cash crop after being introduced by the African Americans, as we'll see under slavery. 65 million tons were produced by the eve of the Revolution. And then in the 1740s, you had indigo introduced to southern Carolina. And the reason that rice and indigo were so fruitful in southern Carolina was due to the swampy marsh areas that much of the colony had. Now the southern colonists bought manufactured goods by producing the tobacco, rice, indigo, catching animals for their furs, and producing lumber from the forest, including tar and resin. And this became a production area for raw materials that were shipped back to England and Scotland, and they acquired manufactured goods. So the South is going to develop a little bit differently than the North, in that they will be agriculturally based, while the North starts to become more industrial with the bigger cities, although Charleston will become one of the bigger cities in the New World. But the bigger cities and with the more industrial and shipping interests of the North will quickly take over and separate the two sides of the country. The other factor was slave labor. And slave labor was absolutely necessary for the hard effort that was required to produce rice and indigo. Now, African Americans were already hard at work in tobacco production in the Virginia and Maryland, and the reason that slave labor was used was that you could occupy a person's time in these industries. If you had times that were busy and then times that were slow, slave labor might not be the best method to handle the labor needs, like in the North, where they would hire people to work when the ships came in and fire them when the ships were empty or when they didn't have any new ships to unload. And so in the North, you had to earn your wages when you could. In the South, they kept African Americans as slaves. So you see, by 1730, 3 out of every 10 people south of Pennsylvania was black, but in South Carolina you have a majority of black citizen or black people. They weren't allowed to be citizens for the most part, outnumbering whites 2 to 1. And this was the first and only colony that had a majority black population, and you will have that later on in the states, especially the Deep South. But this was unique in the colonies. Now, slave regulations are discussed in a separate lecture about Virginia and their development of slavery, and in the video that I recommend, The Making of America's Slavery, which is available on the website. But in South Carolina and throughout the South, slave codes were created to keep African Americans without any kind of power. They weren't allowed to travel without permission, carry guns at all, be on plantations after a certain amount of time. It was to be reported to their masters, and the threat for running away was often mutilation, castration for the men, and even death. So the slave codes were very, very harsh. Now, slaves that could speak English, use European tools, were often given a little bit more freedom, were given a little bit better treatment, but also were more likely to run away. Frederick Douglass is a prime example in the late 1700s who learned to read, and in reading he found that he could learn about freedom, and he hadn't had a real conception that people were free or that he could aspire to be free, and that knowledge, that education encouraged him and in fact allowed him to run away and become one of the leading spokespeople against slavery and for freedom once he had acquired his own freedom. Now, field hands were often kept at the lowest possible level of degradation, of treatment. Slave rebellions were rare in the American South, although in the video I recommend they talk about the Stono Rebellion, which was really the only violent major rebellion by slaves during the colonial period. But slavery, of course, will become a major factor in the South, and we will discuss this throughout the course. Once the Carolinas in 1712 were divided between North Carolina and South Carolina, North Carolina developed a colony of small farms and fur trading, while in South Carolina, as I said, they developed the rice and indigo trade. Now, the other third of the Carolinas remained unsettled until 1733, and at that time, James Oglethorpe will propose the new colony of Georgia, and this was considered very revolutionary. He wanted the colony to bring in people, either criminals, or Oglethorpe also worked to bring in an orphanage and provide small farms for a variety of people from England that had no future in England. They were either going to be in poverty or in jail. And so they hoped to limit each landholder to 50 acres. They banned alcohol, they banned slavery, and they wouldn't let them trade with the natives. Of course, this was extremely rigid and did not last long. And once people were over in the New World, they quickly started to expand their horizons, drink, started to grow the cash crops with some slaves, and by 1752, Georgia had joined its southern brothers of the Carolinas, North and South, in the slave trade and in plantation type properties. Now, settlers moved into the rest of the backcountry in Georgia as well, the Scots-Irish and the Germans. By 1770, the backcountry had about 250,000 settlers, which was 10% of the population, yet they were often kept out of politics, they were often ignored, and that will become part of the story as the revolution approaches, with this group of discontented immigrants adding force to the resentment against Great Britain, against the king, and will lend itself to provide soldiers and the effort against the war.